Hey, this is Mark Goldberg with the UN Affairs blog UN Dispatch, chatting with
Matthew Lee of Inner City Press, chatting to you from within the United Nations.
Hey, Matthew, how you doing?
Pretty good, doing okay.
So the storm at the UN has calmed. We're talking about a week after the UN summit. Matthew, how was it inside the building when, what was it, something like 150 heads of state all converged in your office?
Yeah, well, no, actually, there were some pretty close to here. You know, I did lure some people upstairs, but no, the building was under, like, the whole area was under lockdown, particularly
the whole side of the city, right?
Yeah, the Tuesday that began it was very with Bush and Ahmadinejad and the rest of them. It was really, and actually even places in the building where reporters can usually go, such as like the delegates lounge bar and other places were totally. They created all these little side rooms for bilaterals between states, kind of like it really was kind of like just like little shacks, but like all the windows were covered with curtains so nobody could shoot inside, and it was I'm trying to think. There actually was NGOs were complaining because normally they can get in the building, they couldn't get in the building unless, of course, they were sort of like on the ends, Microsoft. This is actually there are many things to be said about the heads of state, but few people knew that Bill Gates himself was a head of state, and I say that somewhat facetiously, but it was considered even by proponents of it somewhat extraordinary. He spoke from the floor of the General Assembly with that whole green marble wall behind himself. And that's fine. I mean, he spoke in the capacity of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, and he was on a number of panels with Ban Ki-moon, and everyone thought this was a sort of a great convergence of the private sector and the public sector. But a troubling factoid, as always, as you might imagine, that grabbed my attention was a small sign on the fourth floor of the delegates' dining room, which in the middle of the general debate, probably one of the higher profile days, maybe it was Wednesday, the day after Bush's speech, a small sign that said, Microsoft, African heads of state, reception. And this is rare. Like, I mean, they made this whole big deal of, like, NGOs are not in, this is all heads of state. So it grabbed my eye.
What day of the week was this?
This was Wednesday. This was still a very high profile. This was not garbage time by any means, because the heads of state were still all here. In fact, there were some dozen African heads of state meeting with Microsoft. Now, the question became... Go ahead. No.
I was going to just sort of interject that the reason sort of Bill Gates was there this year of all years is that this year was the tagging along to the World Summit. The Secretary General and others planned what's called the Millennium Development Goals sort of halfway point summit. So this year, the Millennium Development Goals for the uninitiated are something like 8 development goals agreed upon by heads of state in 2000 at the Millennium to be reached by 2015. And these are things like reducing by half the number of people who live under $1 a day, reducing extreme sort of hunger, and increasing sort of education opportunities for women. I can't name all of them, but you sort of get the
drift. There's 8 of them, sure.
Development markers. And this year was something of the halfway point, sort of to judge sort of where we stand and where we need to go to reach those goals. So the theme of the World Summit this year, and in fact the theme of all the meetings on Thursday of the summit, was the Millennium Development Goals and development.
I'm going to disagree with you.
Bill Gates and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation are being like the largest development and public health nonprofit in the world. Clearly I think have a stake in this. So
sure, I'm not saying that
it's not like weird that he was there.
No, not that he was there. No. There's 2 things. First, I want to just for the purposes of being contentious, I will say that the theme of the general debate was generally hijacked to the world financial crisis. That became the theme. Right. There was a day, however, devoted to Millennium Development Goals, a high level event.
Yeah, that was Thursday.
Right. But it wasn't.
That was back at the end of. Yeah. So it wasn't when all the heads of state were speaking. That was Tuesday and Wednesday?
Yeah, correct.
This came on Thursday, the day after, where they had foundation people like Bill Gates and others.
Sure. Howard Buffett. Okay. Howard Buffett was here.
Warren Buffett, probably.
No, it was Howard Buffett. Warren doesn't come here. Howard Buffett is one of the sons of Warren Buffett, and he's given a lot of money too. They were on a panel with the head of the World Food Program talking about a program to buy food locally from countries in Africa mostly. They also had the president of Uganda and Rwanda and of Tanzania. So it was pretty extraordinary. But I want to say, obviously, the actual heads of state speeches and most of the Q&As, of which there were many, press conferences and stakeouts, I was very surprised how central, because these guys are, you thought they came here to talk about foreign policy, but most of the heads of state came with their own national media in tow. And so since the markets were melting down, like the Tuesday night, the Australian Foreign Minister Kevin Rudd, not Foreign Minister, Prime Minister,
Prime Minister, yeah.
Prime Minister did his stakeout mostly for his own media, and every question they asked was, "What are you going to do about the banks? Is our economy strong?" I decided to go that route and say we're going to go off the UN Plaza, plantation now, and say there is, although the bailout bill is apparently certainly passed the Senate and will soon pass the House. At least when I was down in D.C. One of the issues that arose among either far right wingers or actually some left wingers, some know-nothingers, was should the bailout benefit non-U.S. institutions, i.e. even sovereign wealth funds which bought predatory loans which were securitized? Should the American taxpayer make good on those debts? And some people think no, believe it or not, Mark. I might actually be one of them. But
okay.
No, seriously. I mean, particularly if you're dealing with a developing country, it seems strange to have Sarkozy and Gordon Brown all beating the drum that the U.S. should bail out their banks. Don't you think?
Yeah. Listen, well, I think you should let viewers know that in your other life you are you're the author of Predatory Bender, a novel about subprime.
Oh, well, I'm coming out of the closet then, Mark. I have to because this was one of the strange.
This is your beat here.
No, exactly. There was a total intersection. And I found myself asking. I asked Kevin Rudd, how can he justify? And not just how can he justify. I mean, what's so interesting is to see what was initially a kind of a relatively obscure debate in the United States about the propriety of subprime high interest rate lending. At one time, mostly to the poor, then to the middle class and others, and then have it become like literally the central topic of Gordon Brown, Sarkozy, Kevin Rudd. I mean, even the Japanese, and here was the intersection with the MDGs. Just that will go back on the plantation. Okay. Is the open question was, if the world is already behind in meeting the Millennium Development Goals by 2015, normally these type of get-togethers are a forum for Ban Ki-moon and others to say, the first world, Jeffrey Sachs, you know what I mean, the whole gang, to say it's an outrage, the developed world must step up its contributions. Obviously this year with this timing, that was a hard message. They managed to sort of cobble together what seemed to be $16 billion of commitments. I want to say that as the resident skeptic, they never produced a list. They never said where the number came from, which doesn't mean it's not the right number, but it just means it seems pretty dubious a week after they said 16 billion to not just put out a one-pager and say, this is from Gates, this is from Buffett, this is from this country. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I didn't realize. I'm sorry, something in my eye. I'm rubbing my eye.
Okay.
I didn't realize that that there was going to sort of be like an actual outcome of the meeting in terms of sort of
dollars. Oh, they wanted there to be an outcome. Definitely, they also were. Yeah, and the thing is, I mean, in a way, you have to give them credit. They were sort of like operating without a net. Like they didn't want to say, they didn't know what the outcome was going to be. They also did this weird, and now we'll get back to that Microsoft thing because they had an event run by the UN Global Compact, which is the UN's interface with the corporate world. The theme, see, and again, they chose these themes like probably a month or more in advance, so they didn't know that the stock market was going to tumble 700 points and that various things would happen. But they chose food pricing, which is obviously another crisis. Yeah. I mean, there are all these competing crises, right? But
it's one of those things where, at least the food prices, it's one of those things where the sort of financial downturn here in the United States was presaged by the global food crisis in a way.
Maybe there are people
we knew there was a world economic
rice.
crisis going on when people were rioting over food.
No, I remember. Oh, absolutely. No, absolutely. That. I mean, I think it's going to take wonkier minds than certainly mine to try to. I don't know if the financial contagion is related. They may intersect as to oil. We'll just leave that one there. But the UN, in its infinite wisdom, summoned the CEOs of major corporations, ranging from Ericsson to Monsanto to KPMG, and then they titled the event one that was all about food pricing. But the question arose, and the press was allowed to attend, but sort of sit in the corner and watch some of the debate, and then come back, and they had a very disorganized sort of Q&A session. But the question sort of was, what do these companies? I mean, for example, like Ericsson, what are they really doing about food pricing? They may do great in terms of like the digital divide and like cell phones. I mean, I don't know. They tried to come up with something like, well, farmers can use their cell phone to call ahead with their crops. But it's like, okay, it seems sort of stretching it. Like, it's good to have a theme, but you might want to say, like, what do you got? What does this corporation want to work on? But the killer for me was Monsanto, which I think not to be on this. I may be to the left of you, Mark. I'm a call me knee jerk. If I hear Monsanto, I'm thinking death seeds. I'm thinking
that's funny. That was like ingrained in my brain in college. I never.
You don't believe it? Jeffrey Sachs doesn't either. Jeffrey Sachs told me it's not true.
I really don't like this. This sounds bad, but I just
Are
don't
you
care to
prejudiced
investigate.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
Do you like or not like Monsanto? I'm guessing you don't like them viscerally.
You know, it was one of those things where the name sort of brings up bad connotations in my mind.
It's like Dow Chemicals.
But like I really like it sounds bad, but I really don't. It's not an issue that interests me at all.
I can't believe it. How can you?
I know.
How can you be for the MDGs and you don't care about food? About the destruction of India's patrimony, its genetic patrimony.
Right. You know, it's one of those things. Like I understand that it gets people riled up. And
it gets me riled up, Mark.
Well, it clearly does. And
it really does. And
preach then. Preach to me.
I'm going to preach to you. I'm going to preach to you that the absolute ludicrousness of the UN, because of its total lack of standards, any corporation that just flashes a little green can get in the building and can be given the imprimatur as being part of the solution, even if they are, in fact, part of the problem. And although I've got a very angry letter from Monsanto, which I've published in full in Inner City Press, in which they say, of course, they defend their intellectual property, but that doesn't make them death seed purveyors. I want to say that there's a pretty good argument that some of these major agro businesses are part of the problem in food. They may well have a small philanthropic arm on the side. They may well have, but the UN should be saying to them, why are you part of the problem or not, rather than saying, if you're willing to come and even come to our luncheon, we'll give you a photo op with I mean, not that means maybe a photo op with Ban Ki-moon, in which you can say, it's sort of like they're so desperate. Ban Ki-moon had a meeting that nobody covered with advertising executives. Nobody knows what it was about, but there's this kind of sense that, like, it's such an honor for the UN to get corporations in the door that you really don't want to ask the hard questions. Because, look, they mean well. But the reality is these corporations, they're not here for their health. You know what I mean? I'm not saying it gets them that much more profit either. But it certainly gives them, I know for a fact that when these corporations are then challenged by people on the ground, let's take Coca-Cola. It's a big company. It strains credulity to me that this soda company could be the root of all evil.
I'm holding up a Coke Zero in front of the camera here.
Say again? Okay. Oops, take it. I'm drinking Mountain Dew, so I don't know who owns what Eagle conglomerate owns it, but I will Mountain Dew. All right.
But the reality,
I think maybe part of your skepticism comes from, and I have it too. Like I may be kind of like at root anti-corporate, but when somebody says to me like Coca-Cola is a killer, I'm a skeptic too. How is it killing people? And then you look into it further and you find out they actually killed some labor organizers in Colombia. They really did. And they divert water in parts of South Asia so nobody can drink anything. Now, of course, they don't agree to that, and so be it. And around it goes. But there doesn't seem to be at the UN any vetting whatsoever. You know what I mean? There was an event about clean water they held, sponsored by Dow Chemicals. And that day, right across the street, there were these guys from Southeast Asia protesting about napalm. And that doesn't mean that a corporation is guilty forever, right? Although I will say that here in New York, Allianz tried to get its naming rights on the Jets and Giants football stadium, and because of their role in the Holocaust, that's it. They're out. And that might seem very knee-jerk, but I say in a way, if we're going to say no impunity for Bashir, what about no impunity for Monsanto? Mm-hmm. And again, they wrote a letter. I'm wildly convinced, obviously, but I mean, I ran it. I mean, they have their argument, mm-hmm. But I don't know why. I feel like you may carry it too far, though. If you're going to be a good liberal, Mark, you have to incorporate the anti-corporate portion. In fact, let's go off the plantation again. Where do you stand on the bailout? Where do you stand on
the bailout?
Where do you stand on the bailout?
This is one of those issues where I really don't think anyone claims to sort of have a full mastery of.
Sure. But I'm going to claim I do.
Well, actually. I look at sort of the political leaders whose judgments I trust in the past, and the consensus.
Who are these leaders?
Also, not only that, but also the liberal pundits, whose sort of values I think I share, and whose reading and writing I respect. Say,
let's have some names.
Let's have some Paul Krugman. We're talking about this today, Thursday. He is. I'll go where Paul Krugman takes me, and
you put Tom Friedman. Is Tom Friedman on your list?
He seems to be. he seems to be for this, the bill. So the Senate passed the bill last night. We're awaiting the House as we speak. This is going to air on Sunday, so who knows what's going to happen by then. But for me at least, and I sort of, I guess, outsource my expertise to people whose expertise I value and trust, and that lends me to support this bill tepidly, because
you're not at all
because
concerned.
Krugman also tepidly supports it. Now
you're not at all concerned.
Well, I should say maybe we can bring this back to international relations just a bit. I feel like in 2002 there were probably a lot of people in my position who in sort of that sort of have this sort of same relationship, say I have with the writer Krugman, who are liberals who didn't really know that much about Iraq and who outsourced their thinking about Iraq to columnists like Tom Friedman.
Sure.
And that's so I know there's a potential trap I'm setting myself up for by sort of outsourcing my views on this to someone on the New York Times op-ed page.
We'll even forget op-ed. We'll tie this one off with an open question. Who is the Judy Miller of the bailout?
Who is the Judy Miller of the bailout?
Because I won't even answer. I'm glad to have sussed you out. I just think it's ironic.
Matthew, I'm sorry. I just want to turn this because you actually are an expert in these things. As I said,
I'll say briefly.
You're one of the
original. I'm one of the original. I'm the old school. I said it was predatory before they were using the word. I said it would all work out badly, and it's all turned out to be true. So I get calls every day saying you proved to be right. Why aren't you celebrating? But
Matthew,
there's nothing to celebrate.
Maybe for our viewers' sake, you can just maybe explain sort of your history in that world.
Very briefly. I actually, before there even was subprime lending. So in a time before the predators ruled the world.
Okay.
There was redlining. Redlining was the concept, and the concept was banks aren't lending in poor neighborhoods, and so there's a law called the Community Reinvestment Act.
Right.
And actually, I was at that time a squatter, to be entirely candid, but I was also I was like a community activist. So like the connection was, why did all these buildings in the South Bronx become abandoned? And whether it's really the main reason or not, it was a very interesting reason to fasten on. Disinvestment. Insurance companies unwilling to invest, therefore landlords burned their buildings down. Banks unwilling to lend, therefore no one could repair them.
Yeah.
So we started using the law and as Inner-City Press, challenging banks to lend more in the South Bronx. Now,
and can you give us like sort of a time? What year is this about?
This is in the 90s. This is in about the mid-90s.
And you're a lawyer, correct?
I became because of squatting. It's a long story, but yeah. Okay. But I don't. No, I don't. We're really going far afield here. But it's actually. I was just thinking like we'd missed the opportunity to say But in saying like you fight the banks to make them lend in poor neighborhoods, then later you fight to make them lend fairly and not at abusive rates. There is right now in the blogosphere. I'm sure you've seen this. There's a now sort of a critique of the Community Reinvestment Act, that the real cause of this is this law that made banks lend in poor neighborhoods.
Right. I just want to say, when you say blogosphere, it's the conservative blogosphere that is pushing this line.
It's now appeared.
I can't remember who said it, but someone, and I'll post a link to it. But there was an item somewhere where, in fact, people are just sort of blamed, essentially, African Americans for the financial crisis because of the Community Reinvestment Act.
That's correct. Yeah. And I've seen that, and I've been actually getting a lot of calls and like, is it true? And I'd feel remiss if we can veer back however you want, but I want to say this. I actually, not just as a supporter of the law and an ideologue, but in terms of just like trees instead of the forest, the reality is yes, it's true that many banks like Citigroup and HSBC got into subprime and even predatory lending. But it is absolutely untrue that they did it to comply with the Community Reinvestment Act. And the proof of that is that the CRA is a very weak law, but what they do is they examine banks, like not Citigroup, they look at Citibank, just the bank. And the bank, when it gets examined for CRA, is able to say, we want you to consider the loans of our bank and of our affiliate. And it could be a mortgage company or the subprime finance company. And without exception, none of the banks ever sought Community Reinvestment Act credit, i.e. to have the examiners look at the subprime loans. So they clearly didn't make the loans to comply with the law. Do you know what I mean? I mean, it's a very, maybe I'm saying it too fast, but it's a very simple, and again, this is actually one where I should be, I know that you have this thing called Critics Watch on UN Dispatch. I should be sort of like I actually don't even resent the right-wingers that make this argument. It's kind of devious, and I have to give them credit. It's very smart to sort of take the pressure off, Wall Street and greed by like blaming the law and community activists and poor people, for this global contagion. So it's sort of, it's an interesting advocacy stretch, but anyone that honestly that looks at it closely, it's not just sort of like, I will say this though, there is some truth to that were some of the Democrats in a totally like kind of sleazy relationship with Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. This is true. Were in fact some Clinton administration officials like Robert Rubin, did they go to work for groups like Citigroup that do subprime and predatory lending? They do. Did they defend that lending as somehow democratizing credit? I'm not talking about lending in poor neighborhoods. I'm talking about high interest rate lending. That's the next thing next to loan sharking was defended not only by right-wing deregulators, but by some Clintonistas. So there's definitely blame to go on both political parties. But in terms of the law comes out smelling like a rose. And here, smell it, We can double back. We've gone too far afield.
Listen,
it happens.
I'm glad, it's very timely, and I'm glad we can.
No, and it did hijack the general debate. So I think we can say it hijacked this episode. But now we're going to.
There you go. No. Well, I want to probe you a little further. What are your feelings on the $700 billion bill just passed the Senate?
The responsible talking points of those, those in whose circle I swim, is that it doesn't really. What people should understand, this is not a bailout of borrowers facing foreclosure. It's really just saying to financial institutions, including non-banks, people that bought securities knowing that they were toxic. It's a bailout of them. It's buying bad loans. In many cases, so the idea of the sort of like the U.S. in the Great Depression, people being thrown out of their homes, this does not stop that at all. All this is to make it so that financial institutions aren't paralyzed by unknowable losses to foreclosures. But since nor does this bill provide consumer protections going forward to make sure this doesn't happen again. So that's kind of the responsible way to oppose it. And I know many people, I went down to D.C. and met with them, their idea is to say, you can't stop the bailout because it's, the perception is that the economy will stop if you don't do it, and also the lobbying power of, Goldman Sachs, etc. So what you have to do is to complain and try to get some consumer protections and bail out for Main Street, as they say,
So
as well.
Should you
I'm actually
the bill
fundamentally
that passed the Senate?
Personally, I'm, and this is why I think it's always sort of funny how partisan politics. Personally, I find it sticks so much in my craw. Maybe I'm just like a kind of a doctrinaire, but $700 billion that will predominantly go to like high-flying financial institutions, I'm against it. I have to say, I was actually in my gut when the House Republicans voted against it, or whenever that was, I was like, all right, And it's ironic to me that, and this is, I know it's a very simplistic way to put it, but the Democratic Party, which on paper and ostensibly and maybe in reality is supposed to be the party of the little man, and the caricatures that the Republicans are like for the fat cats, like the guy from the Monopoly board, when the proposal to give $700 billion almost entirely to highfalutin financial institutions came up, the only little breakaway faction that voted against it were Republicans. And that's weird. I find that strange, and I know that they have bad reasoning, and it's because they ideologically think it's socialism, and they want to keep the. But it's amazing that you could. I don't know. So on that one, it's almost like some of the UN issues that we talk about. I find myself, although innately and historically to the left, I suddenly find myself standing on the side with some right wingers. But you can't. I don't choose where to stand based on how the people next to me smell or whatever.
It was interesting. Apparently the. Sort of number one variable as to whether or not a member of Congress, a member of the House of Representatives, voted against this, against the bill last week or earlier this week, was whether or not they were in a close race.
Right.
I found that pretty interesting.
No, but that is, but that also shows that's the popular perception. And then we could say, well, they're just sleazy politicians trying to vote the way their constituents want. Well, I thought that's what representative democracy was, number one. And number two, I've heard that, but I think when you look at the roll call, the stumbling block, right? The stumbling block was these House Republicans. And they've apparently now been bought in, but with a variety of extra tax cuts. And I just think it's very. whatever. I don't mean to. I mean, I know it's kind of a weird position to find. It's sort. I mean, it's not dissimilar in the UN world to that whole thing of North Korea and UNDP. You know what I mean? It's like normally, like I'd be for development. I'm not saying this about me. I'm just saying there's some weird. Sometimes there's a weird. In the same way that I would have thought that Democrats would be all about Democrats, so liberals, Democrats would be for human rights, and therefore might have a concern of UNDP doing business in North Korea. For a different political reason, they actually say, look, it's the right-wingers trying to stop it. Thank God we're back in North Korea. And really, thank God? Is that... So it's sort of like... I mean, I would almost put, like, kind of knee-jerk anti-Wall Street is kind of like human rights. I still do that. Maybe I'm old school. To me, it's
Well, here,
please tie it up in a knot because I'm gushing here. I'm gushing here, Mark.
No, it's good. Hey, I was interested to hear your perspective.
Okay.
So maybe a similar moral quandary is right now off the coast of Somalia.
Mm-hmm.
Pirates have hijacked $30 million worth of former Soviet military goods, materiel. What? So if I'm frankly of one. I would rather that these I don't mind pirates hijacking guns on their way to Somalia.
Right.
Is maybe the snarky way to put it. But in all seriousness, I'm wondering. So I'm wondering how this is playing out in the halls of the UN right now.
Right. No. It's surprisingly very little actually.
Yeah.
There have been various discussions about piracy, and it was added to a resolution. But there's also we're in a bit of a lull because during the general debate, the council only met sort of on emergency. They did pass an Iran resolution, which we can talk about, but they didn't. Right now that the baton's being handed over to China, China has a new ambassador. So I have to say, despite this like incredibly significant event, which is the main thing is like, wait a second, where were these tanks going? They tried to say that these tanks were going to Kenya. The thing is that these are like Russian tanks, and Kenya has British tanks. And anyway, Kenya doesn't have a lot of tanks. So then it came out like they were really headed for Sudan. I'm just, as a skeptic, were there proof that these were going to like Khartoum and President al-Bashir of Sudan, I think you'd have the U.S. and others talking a lot louder about it. Which means the third theory, which is that this may be a delivery meant for the South Sudan, which wants to become its own country but doesn't yet have any of this material, gives it a little more legs. But I think...
Not only that, but they're sort of both sides in the North Sudan and South Sudan are sort of, are gearing up for a return of war with each other. So
right, absolutely. I saw a headline which I haven't read yet today, but we'll even put a link. So we'll just roll the dice on that one, calling Abyei this disputed oil-rich terrain either between North and South Sudan, or actually probably in South Sudan, but it's something that the North doesn't want to let go of, even if they let go of the rest of South Sudan, as the new Kashmir. Check that out. It was a pretty catchy headline. Sometimes you don't need to read the article, Mark. You just
Abyei
just the headline.
Kashmir.
Is the new Kashmir.
And not only that, but I think Kashmir is the new Afghanistan under Taliban. I don't know if I'm sure you're following this.
Wait a second. The Taliban are the new Led Zeppelin. That's my joke. The song all right.
There you go.
There we go. No, I'm sorry. I don't mean to take... No, there's a lot of analogies. I missed that one.
The analogy is this, that and so this is something I've read on sort of the UN website itself, is that violence in Kashmir is increasing pretty dramatically. Now this is sort of, and not only that, but the sort of Muslim Kashmiris are rallying around Islam in ways that they had not in the past. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of raising some concerns and raising some alarm bells. There's actually a pretty good Christian Science Monitor article on this a couple weeks ago. We'll post a link to.
Let's post it. I think our links are getting out of control here. Yeah, no, definitely.
And this kind of came onto my sort of radar screen when I read about sort of rioting Kashmiris outside the UN Observer Mission office.
Mm-hmm.
Threatening all sorts of violence, and understandably frustrated with the UN Observer Mission that had been there since 1947 or something like that. So
I think it's like UNIMAGIP. It has a very long
or something like
that.
Yeah,
it has a very long acronym. Nobody cares about that.
The long short of it is that apparently there's a resurgence of militant Islam in Kashmir.
Sure.
It had always been there, but apparently it's gaining in popularity.
Well, didn't they have Lakhtar al-Talimi? Not Lakhtar Brahimi, of course, but there was the name of a... There was a... I mean, I think that some of the real militants there have these, like Islamic names in the Kashmir region. But, no, there's no... I think it's because the underlying... The underlying land dispute that set off this recent tension had to do with land for a Hindu temple. So this definitely drove some of the Muslim Kashmiris. I will say that even on that here, and I get this, I mean, there are at least 2 Pakistani journalists based here at the UN that I know quite well, and they've been every day asking, like, is the Secretary General going to say anything about Kashmir? And it's like the answer is no. That's become clear. And the same, I actually on that theme. Now we'll leave all this scattershot stuff to the side and say, I'm ready to say this to you, Mark. It's come to a head. The question has been raised in a number of publications, including the Washington Post, El País from Spain, and the Scotsman, of course, that publication. Is Ban Ki-moon an entirely ineffectual Secretary General? El País said it best. Ban Ki-moon, the invisible man. And I say this not with glee, but to say it became so, this insidious criticism of his style was a big deal during the general debate. Many people talked about it. And in fact, right after the general debate was over, the Secretariat rolled out, not Mr. Ban, in fact, Mr. Ban, who is a very affable gentleman, has been dodging the press for weeks. This may end on Tuesday, but he's canceled the press availability about Myanmar. The other ones, he said, well, he's on the podium, but he won't take questions. They sent 2 of his senior advisors, one of whose name you've probably heard, Bob Orr, who's a longtime American ASG. The other one is Nick Haysom, who many people know less. He was Nelson Mandela's lawyer and a fine man about town. And he finally appeared on the podium, on the record, to defend Ban. Bob Orr said, and this is a quote, Ban Ki-moon is a giant. Because somebody asked him to compare Ban Ki-moon and Kofi Annan, and they said, well, one was a bigger personality. And he said, I disagree. Both men are giants. Mm-hmm. Nick Haysom took a different state, said it's not for him to talk about the relative size of individuals. Which is a very good lie. But no, it was funny. But I'm saying, I think what I'm trying to say to you is, and I don't know if maybe this is, right now it's inside the UN, but it's not just a few naysaying, skeptical publications. It's, I mean, an entirely mainstream journalist from the Middle East said the other day, what does he say to this critique? That not that he doesn't work hard. Everyone knows he works hard. There's the idea that the style doesn't work. There's kind of like, and so what Bob Orr said. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No. Go on. Sorry.
No. I wanted to say, because maybe this will take us back where we get us back on track. The defense, and these guys have definitely thought, they've sat up on the 38th floor looking out, as I'm looking out at Queens, but from a much greater height, and they've come up with a theory. And the theory is that, not that the world doesn't need a general but only a secretary, but that the UN's new role is no longer to be a prominent problem solver in disputes between states, threats to international peace and security, because he's not doing that. He's not, even Kenya was solved by Kofi Annan. Zimbabwe, if it was solved by Mbeki. You know what I mean? Georgia, he was invisible.
I'm trying to think of examples when major disputes between states were solved by the UN in
I'm sure we can find some. To keep it moving, rather than say solved, let's say that the UN had a visible role, was viewed as kind of like the referee that people would go to. And I think even on Iraq, it didn't work, but you had, I wasn't here to say that. Maybe Kofi Annan only said that as a wag the dog moment. I don't know. But I will say, I caught the tail end of Kofi Annan, and Kofi Annan did not shy away from saying, this problem, there's a human rights, we must get to the end of it. Let me send in a desperate way, send an envoy, and just sort of like eat up some camera time and wring his hands. At least that. These times, in the Georgia thing, I don't think Ban Ki-moon was put on. It's not a question that he was put on TV. It's not to be superficial, but various people have written, where the F was the guy? Where was the guy?
Well, I think we've gone over this. In like the thing with Georgia, it's nearly impossible for Secretary General to do anything because you have a veto-wielding member. It's a conflict involving a veto-wielding member. He
sure pissed off that.
I'm trying to think of because you raise a good point. So you ask sort of what has sort of the UN sort of done.
What has it done? That's the question.
Interstate conflicts have the UN resolved? Like the UN has the UN resolved interstate conflicts,
right?
Let's brainstorm.
Oh no, you mean going all the way back? Wait, I'm not prepared.
Just say the last 10 years, just in the Kofi Annan era and in the Ban Ki-moon era.
So let's even say, look, you were even during the Israel-Lebanon thing. You had Kofi Annan taking to the. I'm not saying he stopped it. That's a conflict larger than all of it.
But
you had him saying,
a big believer. I think I wrote an op-ed.
Yeah, you had him saying, and here I am praising Kofi Annan. He was willing to say this is wrong, carpet bombing wrong, this thing wrong. This guy, and I don't think P5 is an excuse.
Also of what Annan did during the 2006 like sort of month-long war was behind the scenes. He I don't know if you remember, he went on his big Middle East tour right sort of in the middle of the war, and he convinced.
There you go.
He was able to convince the Turkish army to send troops there.
But that's what I mean. Right. Exactly.
Well,
Sorry.
I'm just saying he did a sort of a lot behind the scenes that was very important.
No, but look. This guy was very conscious. I mean, he did it behind the scenes, and then he called reporters to film him getting on the airplane. So that's fine.
Well,
but I'm saying they had a visible role. You wouldn't. Everyone knew what the UN was about. The UN was about sort of like being the one thing that wasn't either on one side or the other, and could fly around and try, and you sort of like it gave you hope, and even if it didn't work. So I forget for a moment. They have a theory. They're admitting. They don't dispute that he doesn't do that. He doesn't do that. He's not doing that. Their claim is that that's no longer what people want from the UN. Now, I don't know if that's true. I don't know if you're a victim in one of these places, you don't want that. But their claim that Ban Ki-moon's time is the time for thematic issues, like climate change, like food pricing. These are they're trying to find a rationale for the UN to be in on the financial crisis. That's not going to work, frankly. But they're saying that this is why, this is the difference. It's a cognitive shift.
Well, I mean, I'd argue that that's something like these you call it just a thematic issue, but there are nuts and bolts to the climate change issue, which is the post Kyoto protocol, the successor to Kyoto, which runs out in 2012, will be negotiated in Copenhagen this year. And this is like a big. I mean, this is like one of the most important.
Oh, totally. Like thematic is not an insult. Thematic is not an insult. I just mean it's not.
Well, I'm just saying there are. Well, when you say thematic, people think it's like airy and pie in the sky. But we're talking sort of nuts and bolts
it has to be solved.
Of setting sort of emission standards and sort of climate change adaptation regimes and
they have a phrase for this.
So what's that?
Bob Orr has a phrase for this. He calls it global goods.
Global goods?
Global goods. They're trying to work on delivering the global goods. I mean, I don't know if it means good like in a positive way or like in the sense of like a physical product, but
like in economics.
Yes, this is the theme. Global goods. It's kind of sounds good. He was told to find a new title, but he's actually soliciting them. If any of our listeners or viewers have an idea of a new brand for the UN, but I know I'm definitely doing it in a dismissive way. But I want to say this. This critique would say, fine. Nobody authorized this shift, but if based on your own personality or based on how things have gone in the first 2 years, you want to say that it's clear that there's no place more for the UN to actually have a visible role as people are being slaughtered and killed, then transition over. Transition over.
Listen. You go right now, as I was in Liberia, right? You see a country on the mend.
But that's not his work.
You see a country on the mend. Well, you see a country on the mend because there are 15,000 UN peacekeepers there.
But Mark, my critique here is not of the UN as an organization. The debate is about this debate that arose this week is about Ban Ki-moon as Secretary General. So even to bring up past successes only proves the point more. In this debate, I'm not anti-UN by the way, but I'm saying the idea is that is there, and I understand rather than sort of take the critique and say, you know what, okay. Maybe, there's still time. We're 2 years into a 5-year bid. If it goes well, there's another 5 years. I think what a lot of people were hoping was for him to have sort of a moment in which he pissed off the U.S. and he had to face himself in the desert and decide, you know what, I'm my own man. I may have gone along to get along for a long time, but now I'm at this pinnacle, and what the world and all that is good and right needs me to be is to be a speaking truth to power. And I know that that's a kind of a caricature too. And definitely these guys, Bob Orr and Haysom, they're like, that's not what Ban's going to do. Anyone can rail against the machine. Oh, that's not rage against the machine. But it takes Ban Ki-moon to be inside of the machine or to the side of the machine. But here's what I wanted to. I mean, I think that the critique would say, since and maybe the reporters, the observers, and the pundits are so focused on the old style of diplomacy of like. Kofi Annan flying a secret mission, Dag Hammarskjöld shot down over the Congo, that they don't see what quiet leadership is. But some people here, Ban Ki-moon himself gave a speech in Turin, Italy, to his senior advisors right before the general debate. And he had a line in the speech that said, "I tried to lead by example, and no one followed." This is his line. This is not my line. This is not, he wrote it. Or he didn't write it. We know who wrote it. But he read it. And so the idea is, if you can't, this is sort of an unfair thing. But the idea is, it's very important. Climate change is very important. But if the UN is going to take a lead, you really have to take a lead. Maybe we're missing it. Maybe behind the scenes, Ban Ki-moon strikes fear into the heart of Chinese industrialists about to decide whether to go with coal or some other technology. But a lot of people aren't seeing it. But it's not to be a personal critique. It's to say, like, do they recognize that something is off the tracks? Or do they say, what we've been doing, we're going to do even more of it? Screw peace and security. We're going with, like, whether it's the food crisis or, like, I don't know. So anyway, I'm not gonna get off my soapbox, but I'm gonna stop.
But hold on, I would argue that on the climate change issue, the UN sort of is taking a lead on this. It is sort of the forum. Last year there was the big, the big climate change summit. Yeah. Every single UN agency is somehow involved in climate change.
Destruction to the environment. Yes, they did.
Well, I'm just saying every single UN agency is somehow incorporating climate change into their agendas, from the Postal Union,
exactly.
the International Civil Aviation Union, where if you go to the International Civil Aviation Organization's website, you can calculate your individual carbon footprint for your latest trip, for your next trip.
And thus is the world safe.
At the World Health Assembly, the big theme there was climate change and health. And how the two intersect.
There's all too much wordsmithing and all too little action. You're making my point exactly. UNICEF came to us and said that the number one concern of youth worldwide is climate change. And somebody said, okay, based on what? Where's the poll? And there was nothing there. It was
I know that, but I'm saying that there is meat there. For example, on the intersections of health and climate change, you have things like the sort of global warming is increasing the areas where malaria mosquitoes or encephalitis-laden mosquitoes are prevalent. Right. So there are more places now. Look where I grew up. I grew up in the southern New England. Mm-hmm. There were some cases of mosquito-borne encephalitis back then. Now it's like every summer, a few.
Can we talk about Lyme disease, Mark? Can we go off the tracks?
Off the tracks, yeah.
If we're talking southern New England, you must be talking Connecticut. Are we talking Connecticut?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. With that established. No, I don't. So no. I don't know. I don't mean to be overly negative. I really don't.
No. Listen.
I'm going to, but I will.
Again, also, you look at Anand and you look at sort of Anand early years versus Anand later years.
No, definitely.
And I think there's sort of he was the Secretary General for 10 years.
Correct.
Ban Ki-moon has been the Secretary General for 2 years now.
Right.
Anand came from a UN system. The UN, he'd been a career UN employee. Ban Ki-moon was a career Foreign Service officer in South Korea. So, there's a lot more record of Kofi Annan to look back on than there is for Ban Ki-moon
definitely. And it's unfair.
I'm not saying, I guess to be fair, the record is still out. I don't think you can judge one way or the other whether
I agree.
He's been a failure or whether or not he's been a success.
But I think
you can judge. I think you can get a sense of his priorities. Mm-hmm. Clearly, climate change is a big priority. You get a sense of his style. Clearly, not sort of naming and shaming. He doesn't do a lot of that. He doesn't really seem to do any of it, which was something that Anand did. And frankly, Anand was pretty widely, disliked in a lot of parts of the world for it,
that's part of the job. You're not going to be. It's not a popularity contest.
It's a different, it's a different leadership style, and I think it's I think the jury is still out on whether or not it ends up being a success or failure.
But here's the nitty-gritty story that I think will make the point. It's a very nitty-gritty story, and it's about a particular country. The country is Myanmar, otherwise known as Burma. The situation is one of ruthless oppression, all right? Pretty ruthless oppression. I don't really think you're going to find a lot of disagreements, even among ASEAN, okay? It's pretty ruthless oppression. Fine. The UN has an envoy, Mr. Gambari. He's gone there. His most recent trip, he couldn't meet with Aung San Suu Kyi, Nobel Prize winning. Yeah. She didn't want to meet with him because it's been so useless, according to her. And the senior general didn't meet with him. Fine. Back to square one. There was a meeting during the general debate which had the foreign ministers of all of the group of friends of the Secretary General on Myanmar. So this is a pretty high-powered group. It's not heads of state, but the foreign ministers of, Singapore, of some Western countries, they all met in the basement of the UN on Saturday. And it had been announced for more than it had been announced that at the end of their meeting, Ban Ki-moon will step to a microphone, there will be a camera, and he will speak about the issue of Myanmar. He held his tongue for 3 weeks after Gambari left after this somewhat failed visit. But this was going to be the moment, after all of the build-up. Suddenly, at 10 a.m. that morning, they said Ban Ki-moon is not going to speak. So another reporter had come in only to cover that. So we say, let's go find out why. Somebody tries to say, well, he has other appointments. Well, no, we have his schedule. There's no other appointment until 3:30 in the afternoon. Fine. Then they say, it's been decided that he can't speak until the group puts out a statement. Now, this is weird because he's the Secretary General, right? The whole idea here is, what do you think about your good office's mandate to this country that's being widely denounced as perpetuating a dictatorship, as not being helpful? And to say then, I have to wait for the group, he knew that anyway. I don't think that's the answer because he knew that before Saturday morning. Now, the reality is at 9:40 that morning, he met with the foreign minister of Myanmar. Now, I wasn't in the meeting. I can't prove what was said, but it seems striking that immediately after meeting with the foreign minister of Myanmar, the country at issue, he cancels his speaking availability. And to make things far worse, so then we reporters, because I'm very parochial, said, okay, well, we're still going to go stand in front of the room. We'll talk to the foreign ministers, No, they say, since Ban's not speaking, the press can't go to that area. It's locked down. So we say, well, this is kind of ridiculous. And the reality, whether it's the intention or not, is since Ban won't speak, you can't cover the meeting effectively, You can sit upstairs and write whatever you think, but you can't actually get new info. So we made a little stink, and we were let in. Miliband of Britain spoke, and he railed against Burma and talked about Rangoon and did all of his things. Singapore spoke on the other side. So, okay, so stories could be written. But the reality is they still have never explained, why didn't he say anything? Cat got your tongue? Dictatorship on the move?
I feel like I circle back to this argument.
Go ahead.
Or at least maybe our last two discussions. It's that the UN has a pretty robust humanitarian operation on the ground.
Oh, right.
I've said this before, on the ground in Burma, Myanmar, presumably, or perhaps, or maybe Ban thinks this, or maybe it's been threatened, that if he starts railing against the regime, as you and I perhaps would like to, that humanitarian access might get curtailed.
Do they have humanitarian access under Kofi and
it's a crappy situation, but it's again, I circle back to this. There is this sort of like natural tension between the humanitarian side and that wants to deliver aid, and the human rights side that wants to lock up.
But I think
people.
it's very selective because the Sudan, he's willing to critique Sudan.
But not very loudly,
Much louder than Myanmar.
Well, I think my critique of the sort of not just the UN, but of the international community more broadly is that they're tilted too heavily towards maybe, I don't want to say the humanitarian side, but they're not loud enough in denouncing the Sudanese regime.
No, but if I'm not saying probably they're not, but they're they're strikingly much more
of consent. You need the consent of the host country to.
But I know that's a generic. But
that's why. Remember back in the when the cyclone Nargis hit. That was the big problem. That's why aid couldn't get in there because Burma wouldn't let it. They wouldn't give their consent. You need some sort of cooperation with the government, no matter how odious, to help the people.
Then don't be so disorganized.
In this, impossible situation.
They never promised to speak on the topic. The way this came off was number one, Bush League, but it also looked like you're running scared. And the ultimate written statement that was put out was totally mishmashed and we praise the government for what they've done, and even on the humanitarian front. Again, I guess I want to say is I think it's more nuanced than that because Ban Ki-moon at least was willing to denounce Zimbabwe. He actually did. He personally denounced the ambassador of Zimbabwe, but he also said the elections aren't credible. So it's kind of, you almost have to wonder if he is dancing to the U.S. tune.
Again, if you use the humanitarian access variable,
people need access in Zimbabwe.
There is not as much of a humanitarian operation going on in Zimbabwe as there is in Burma.
Most of that action, there's actually very international aid workers.
But it's not as big.
These generals are totally willing to take whatever you give to them. I mean, they take the money, and there's really not that many international staff there. But I will say, actually, and this is something new, rather than ranting, a senior UN official involved in the Myanmar situation, who was asked to remain unnamed, has provided the Ban Ki-moon administration recently, and I don't even know how to write it yet because of this not for attribution portion. But there is a defense, and the defense is highly ironic. The defense is that the problem with the UN's approach to Myanmar are the Western countries. I was told this only last night. The argument was made. The argument was made that the only way to solve it is to work with China and India, who have large, and to some degree Thailand, which gets a lot of energy from there. And there is a process, and it's very slow, but it is happening. But that the Western countries are beating the drum for more rapid change, but not providing the UN with the cards, the tools that they need. And the argument was, for example, that the West should say to the UN that they can say to Myanmar, if you release Aung San Suu Kyi, we'll remove all sanctions and infuse the country with money. And that they don't do that, and so that in a way the West is hypocritical and is tying and that's it, and it really is. This is a well thought out. I mean, they didn't just deliver this by in the hall. They delivered it in a more formal setting. Not only to me, many people have been given their marching orders to make the case against the West. I'm just not buying it. I think, to be honest with you, now as a confirmed red meat eater, whether Republican or not, the problem in Burma is the military government. That's the problem, And I'm not talking for regime change. I know there's a lot of controversies, but the idea that it's almost like the UN in this case, the Myanmarese have called the UN's bluff and said, we're going to steal your money. What are you going to do about it? The UN thought about it and they said, we're going to cover it up. Now Myanmar has said, you know what, we really don't even need you in the mediation. We can go it alone. We've gone it alone. Some people think we're bad. Our neighbors think we're good. We don't care. And the UN so much wants to be seen as kind of relevant that they're willing to, if they're told don't give a stakeout, they won't give it. There's a part of Myanmar that wasn't hit by the cyclone where now people are starving. The headline is WFP says no famine in Myanmar. And then actually you listen to the clip of this guy talking and he's like, well, there is widespread hunger, but maybe it shouldn't be called famine. Like, all right, I don't know.
See, I'm intrigued by this Western.
Yeah, that is. I'm willing. Let's go.
It's intriguing. It's almost something I could get behind to the extent that the goal is to change the behavior of the regime, not to change the regime itself, right? That seems to be an impossibility, and we've been stuck in this sort of stalemate for too long of a time, and sort of current policy isn't working. I'd be willing to try something else, to dangle the prospect of lifting sanctions for the release of
one individual
political prisoners, with presuming she has a movement behind her. Right. She has popularity there. Hopefully, she might that might be the beginning of the end of the regime without explicitly demanding the end of the regime.
What this senior official? No, I think you're. I mean, it is. It's an interesting idea.
It's interesting. What everything else seems to have failed thus far.
Mm-hmm.
No, go ahead. I was going to say we're about out of time. I don't know. Is there any other?
No, there actually is. As you might imagine, But so just on that one is that this senior official went further and said the problem is they've actually released Aung San Suu Kyi twice. She hasn't been imprisoned all of the last since 1990, but they basically release her. But if she then criticizes the regime, they put her back in. The individual also said that were she not the daughter of Aung San, the founder of modern Burma or Myanmar, she would probably have already been killed by the regime. What really shames them is that she's like a very high profile. She's the daughter of the founder. It's like, what can you do? And there was a couple of other things, but here's the thing I just want to say, because I think that if the upcoming is this what we've discussed before, the resolution by Serbia to get a ruling on Kosovo. And so in very nutshell form, we literally today had the foreign minister of Kosovo came through the press floor here. He's lobbying against the resolution, as you might imagine, telling people that to vote for it will cause more problems in the Balkans, and Serbia's should be treated very skeptically. In the week of the general debate, interestingly enough, various presidents that came through, I will say this, I asked each of them, how are you going to vote and why? And the president of Cyprus said they're going to vote for the resolution. And in part it's because they are obviously very protective of the northern Cyprus part of their own territory. Finland, to their great credit, who has recognized Kosovo as an independent country, said they are nevertheless, the worst they could do is abstain, or they might vote for the Serbian resolution, because they're believers in international law, and they just cannot see voting against a country asking for a ruling, right? Mm-hmm. France, meanwhile, the French ambassador said, which I think, as it turns out, he wasn't supposed to say, that, because they're the president of the EU, he said they haven't decided how to vote yet, but Serbia's very request for this ruling causes turbulence and is a negative development. He said it.
Yeah, interesting.
Which is interesting.
I didn't realize that. So the Security Council can direct the International
No, it's the
Court
General
of
Assembly.
Justice.
The vote's going to be in the General Assembly. That's what's great about it. If it was in the Security Council, it would lose because the U.S. is voting against this.
So the General Assembly can direct the International Court of Justice
to issue a ruling. That is correct. Yep,
that's
and
cool.
that's Serbia's.
That's an interesting quirk of international law.
Yeah, it is. And October 8th, they're going to vote on it. And so the French guy said this, and here's what I want to say. This, I am told that the French President Sarkozy, when he came through, very much read his ambassador the Riot Act and said, you cannot be saying that. That maybe that's even what other French officials think, but since they're the head of the EU, I mean, it's a very tricky thing, right? If you believe in international law, how are you going to vote against a country getting a ruling, no matter what you think of the country, right? And what Serbia says is, check us out. We're the new Serbia. We're not like rolling in. We're asking for a ruling. They're getting very cocky, actually. The guy, no, they are, because they're going to win. They're gonna, you'll hear. This is one of the few things that I'll make a prediction. These guys are going to win on October 8th, and then it's going to slow down all recognitions of Kosovo. Kosovo is that's why they're lobbying against it. They're like, hey, even if it goes there, you know what I mean? No, I mean they're not going to get it. This guy said today.
No, this is fascinating.
It is pretty good.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Yeah.
All right.
I should write about this on UN Dispatch.
You really should. It's coming. You should.
No, it really is. It's pretty fascinating. October 8th is the day.
October 8th.
The day to watch.
It's all set. So, absolutely. And the new the president of the General Assembly, Mr. Miguel Descoto Brockman, has tabled it. Here's just a final factoid for you in terms of like multi-comparison. We had not only Mia Farrow, but Jody Williams, Nobel Prize winner of the anti-landmine campaign, in the building this week, speaking about Myanmar and Darfur. Darfur will be for another day, but on Myanmar, Jody Williams, to her great credit, made an analogy. I asked her about the stealing through foreign currency exchange of part of the aid money. She said, this is no different than Somoza stealing earthquake relief money in 1972 in Nicaragua. And the journalistic plan for tomorrow is to ask Descoto if he accepts this analogy between Somoza and Myanmar.
Descoto being Nicaragua.
Being a Sandinista.
Yes.
So I'm sure he's anti-Somoza, but he may be
pro-Myanmar. What you found out.
Yeah, whatever accomplishment that will lead to. But I think it will. It's
interesting.
It's a left, right, and center kind of a spin.
So quick programming note,
please.
Commenter and regular viewer Wonderman in a thread on a different topic asked us to jump, or asked UN Plaza to jump into the U.S.-India nuclear deal, which I'm been following and I'm pretty interested in. Next week, if all goes according to plan, we're going to be chatting with a representative from the Arms Control Association, someone who is been following this very closely. And we're going to talk about this and non-proliferation more broadly, and maybe look ahead to what the next U.S. president can do to bolster and to repair a crumbling non-proliferation infrastructure.
Repair?
So, thank
Jean-Maurice repair?
And
you've hooked me. You've hooked
What's
me,
that?
Mark. You've hooked me in, Mark. It's must
there
be.
You go.
It's appointment viewing. My internet time is pre-programmed.
And to all the viewers, commenters out there, definitely keep your suggestions for topics coming, and we're here for you.
The point of this is to say we pay attention.
Keep the recommendations rolling.
We really do, and don't be cruel. The cruel comments are but we read them closely.
You can be cruel to me. I don't mind.
I know you've got thick skin over there.
All right, thank you, Matthew.